Thank you, Melissa. I would have totally forgotten about that. So we also want to acknowledge our colleagues who help to conceptualize and really create the 5 essential practices that make up this Essential Practices Guide, who are not with us today. So in addition to Dr. Vaughn and myself, we have Gary Troya from Michigan State University, Hank Feen from University of Oregon, soon to be Boston University, and Michael Coyne, who is with the University of Connecticut. We couldn't have done this without them. You can certainly access the Intensifying Guide on the MiMTSS website. I've included a link. I think, Melissa, I think you can drop the PowerPoint in the chat for people. But we're also, for people who are interested, we also have an order form where you can order printed copies from KRESA's Print Center of the Intensifying Guide. Directions for doing that are right on the order form. Okay, so let's take a moment to get to know who is here today. So I'm going to launch the poll and let's get to know who you all are and the roles that you're representing. Okay, so so far I have 0. Oh, here we go. Okay. It's always a worry of mine that it's human error. I've launched the poll and no one's responding. Okay.
Okay, guys.
For responses. And if you joined us, if you can mute yourself, that would be great. Excellent. All right, so I'm going to close it in about 3 seconds. So 3, 2, 1, we'll end the poll and share the results. So we can see we have really a broad group of individuals spanning elementary, special education, a few secondary educator colleagues, principals, central office administrators, and we have 25% of the group are ISD, either early literacy coaches, consultants, or leaders. Some folks from the state education agency. So thank you for that. Okay, and let me go to my next slide. Hang on a second. You can tell that I'm not Zoom savvy when it comes to polling features, so I apologize. So let's talk about the structure of the guide. So the contents of the Intensifying Literacy Guide really serve as the foundation for being able to establish policy, determine professional learning, allocating resources to support a broad range of learners. This, and we're focusing on literacy, you're going to see in a moment, defining this with reading and writing. And we're focusing on a broad range of learners that includes but is not limited to students with disabilities. The practices in the guide are identified as targeted to leaders. So it could be district leaders like central office administrators, school administrators, or teachers, general educators and special educators, as well as interventionists. So there's been a lot of questions about how the Intensifying Guide relates to or has a relationship with the MAISA Literacy Essentials. So I've got both of these documents here with me, if you can see. And I want to be very clear that the practices for intensifying literacy instruction, these 5 essential practices that are in the guide, apply to learners that have significant and persistent reading and writing challenges and who have not responded to instruction that has been aligned to the essential instructional practices in literacy. So regardless of their disability status. So the Intensifying Guide is intended to work in conjunction with the literacy essentials, not take the place of the literacy essentials. In terms of the relationship to MTSS, in the Intensifying Literacy Instruction Guide, we talk about this information being categorized as Tier 2 and Tier 3 supports. It's important, though, to remember that students who are receiving Tier 2 and Tier 3 reading supports spend majority of their time in the classroom core subject area setting. So they are in Tier 1 majority of the time. So the contents within this guide are relevant across all tiers because all students' needs should be met within Tier 1. We cannot forget the importance of high quality Tier 1 or class-wide reading and writing instruction and the quality of the curriculum resources that teachers have access to be able to effectively teach students how to be skillful readers and writers. And at the same time, we must also be mindful about making decisions about the student's response to intervention instruction. This guide focuses on literacy, and we oftentimes in education use the term literacy. It's important, though, to understand that literacy is really made up of reading and writing, and reading and writing are their own distinct but very interconnected constructs or interconnected set of skills. They are two very unique cluster of skills. Each is recognized as being very valuable to instruction. We have to make sure that we're meaningfully integrating reading and writing, and that is ultimately the goal. The 5 essential practices that are in this guide are right here on the slide, beginning with knowledge and use of a learning progression for developing skilled readers and writers, designing and using an evidence-based intervention platform, and that's the foundation for effective intervention. The 3rd essential practice, ongoing database decision-making for providing and intensifying interventions. The 4th practice, adaptations to increase the instructional intensity of the intervention. And last but not least, infrastructures or systems to support students with severe and persistent literacy needs. Now, we are going to have time to focus more intensively on 3 of the essential practices. We're going to start with essential practice 1. We're going to then delve into essential practice 2, and we're going to round out our time together talking about essential practice 4. We only have an hour and a half together, and we want to make sure we have time to engage you as our audience. So this is just an introduction or our first foray into the contents of the Intensifying Guide. It wouldn't be a multi-tiered system of support professional learning series or training session if we didn't talk about the importance of systems. You notice that the 5th essential practice talked about infrastructures or systems to support students. One of my favorite quotes is in the book Results Now, written by Mike Schmoker, right on page 2. And there's a quote that's listed by Seymour Sarensen. It says, place a good person in a bad system, and the system wins every time. It's important to remember that MTSS is the system. It's the framework that nests the evidence-based practices, programs, assessments, and procedures that are supporting educators and other staff in their use. Systems may not be viewed as glamorous. For my PBIS colleagues out there in the audience, you may have had the gift of hearing Dr. Rob Horner present, and Rob has said that the systems aren't sexy. Many people don't view the systems as sexy. However, without the systems, implementation and outcomes are going to suffer. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Vaughn, who's going to delve into essential practice 1.
Hello, everybody. You know, one of the things I really like about these essential practices is that they are actually not independent. Each one of them influences the other. But essential practice 1 really is first for a reason. And that is because our knowledge and use of a learning progression really is necessary for developing skilled readers and writers. I think we can go to the next one. So let's just start with sort of a model that we can have in our head. And, you know, this model really has helped me as a teacher and as an educator because it allows me to make decisions about what's important based on the progression of the age of the student. And so many of you, I know, have heard of the simple view of reading. But this is what's important. it's not simplistic. It's just simple in that the organizational structure is recognizable and applicable. Let me tell you something that I find interesting. I recently did a search on the simple view of reading, and it has been cited over 1,000 times. I recently did a review on the simple view of reading, and theoretically, it has been tested by more than 20 independent research teams across the world in different languages and with the same result. So what is that result and why is it important? That result is that if we think about word recognition, word reading, being able to decode as an important construct, and we think about linguistic comprehension, that is extracting and constructing meaning from the spoken word. So we think about those two large constructs. Word reading, if students can read the words. Number two, if they know what the words mean and can think about those words within the syntax of the language in which they're using to read. Multiplicatively, not additively, multiplicatively, it equals reading comprehension. And this model has actually been tested, and it's really holds up. If students can read words, they know what those words mean and have an understanding of language, they will be able to understand text. And this particular simple view of reading isn't simplistic for this reason. Because it's multiplicative, what it means is that if there's a zero in either of those two constructs, guess what you get with reading comprehension? When you multiply anything by zero, what do you get? So you get zero, of course. So we need to build both understanding of language and vocabulary and syntax, and we need to build word recognition. And the reason it's important to a progression is because word recognition takes on greater importance in the younger grades, and linguistic and language and meaning take on greater importance in the older grades. So that is how it fits into our progression. Did you want to say something about that, Kim?
No, I think you captured it, Sharon. I think that I wasn't sure if you wanted to delve into the learning progression or if you wanted to talk through this piece. I'm happy to do so. It's totally up to you.
Oh, I'll just finish this with a simple view of reading for beginning readers. They have to have an understanding of this spoken language, like we said, the linguistic comprehension, vocabulary, grammar, and knowledge of the word. And basically, students who have oral language have this. So you don't really have to test for it unless they have underdeveloped language. But they have to really learn how the sounds of our language map to print. And that acquisition is something that needs to be taught. Language is hardwired. Learning to read and print is not hardwired. It requires instruction. So in the reading and learning progression, what we understand is that it represents the things students need in each of these two components, word reading or decoding, linguistic comprehension, to be skillful readers at each grade level. And I just love the way Kim and her team put this together, because I think this is just such a beautiful visual. And what you can see by the arrows, the relative importance of word recognition and linguistic comprehension across the grade levels. And the only reason this is important to you as an educator is for this reason. We can make ourselves crazy trying to figure out all of the different factors that contribute to students' challenges. However, if we understand the relative influence of each of these constructs, we can direct and guide our instruction accordingly. So we know where to emphasize and level our instructional practices. And of course, the reading rope. How many of you have seen the reading rope? I love the reading rope. But really what it basically says is we weave them together, right? We have to have these instructional practices integrated in order to yield reading. And Scarborough taught us that, and we agree. So with practice one, the reading and writing learning progression, we have a very simple view of reading. We also have this simple view of writing. And in both cases, I want to keep emphasizing this, they're not simplistic. So don't think that this is a reductionist model that thinks about reading and writing in the smallest, least sophisticated way. These are very sophisticated models that require us to have deep understanding of what linguistic comprehension is. Or in the case of the writing progression, we need to understand transcription skills, mean we need to be able to write and form letters. Translation skills mean we need to be able to take ideas and put them on paper in the form of writing. And if we can do that, it yields skilled expression. And most of us have underthought about the way in which these transcription skills, actually being able to write and form letters, influence skilled writing, and they do. And again, we have a learning progression to help us with that. So the learning progression takeaways are: developing skillful readers and writers requires instruction in specific skills. And these specific skills can be thought of as constructs, pretty large constructs, but we unpack these constructs in meaningful ways based on the age of students. We know that students need to be taught in these organized components, and we can think of it as a simple view of reading and writing, but not simplistic. And if educators are uncertain about how learning to read and learning to write develop, it might be best to teach the necessary skills. Their ability to intervention is then designed to accelerate outcomes. So if you don't understand this, you might not focus on the most important thing that students need. So that's why we value it.
Thank you, Sharon. Okay, so there was a poll 2 that, unbeknownst to me, was tied with poll 1. So we're just going to do it in an open chat because I don't know if everyone had a chance to see it. I'm curious, to what extent do your teachers, in schools and districts, to what extent do they have an understanding of the simple view of reading? Do you find that they know the multiplicative explanation? They're saying it's not really simple. Feel free to either open your mic or add to the chat. And I will tell you, I've presented with Sharon before. There will come a point where she's going to start asking questions in the chat and even may respond to her own questions if needed. All right. Yep. So, you already added the question. Thank you, Sharon. Do they understand and use the simple view of reading? So we've got some people saying we're doing some work around it. No, they do not. Yep. More than reading. Yeah. Not necessarily the simple view of writing. I see that a lot. Absolutely. Unsure. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing. I like that Gail said if they saw the diagram, they would recognize it. Excellent. Starting, and this really is a journey of thinking about how reading and writing are taught and how the learning progresses. And I'm seeing some people say, yes, lots of professional learning in the last 2 years, particularly the K-1 grades. Excellent. And for those of you who happen to be on our webinar with Dr. Louisa Moats about a month ago, I think it's been about a month ago, you heard Dr. Moats say that educators need to be more knowledgeable than their curriculum resources. I mean, it really is about teacher knowledge and understanding why things are designed the way that they're designed and how to effectively use these various resources. So wonderful. Okay. Oh, and Melissa, thank you for our YouTube channel, because we are doing YouTube live. So yes and no depends on the teachers and the grade levels. Thank you. All right, so now we're going to delve into essential practice 2, which is design and use of an evidence-based intervention platform as the foundation for effective intervention. So let's begin by defining what we mean by an intervention platform. So an intervention platform is really a collection of practices, programs, evidence-based practices, programs that have been intentionally reviewed, carefully evaluated, and selected. And they are used as the foundation or the building blocks for customizing intervention supports. And we're going to unpack what this means in a little bit more detail shortly. But the notion of careful review, evaluation, and selection cannot be underestimated enough. When we're talking about accelerating outcomes, especially right now with all of the potential learning loss as a result of the pandemic, time is of the essence. We want to accelerate outcomes. And so using the things that are research studied and best equipped to get us there is going to be critical. So the thing is, though, the intervention platform resources, we don't intend those to be developed by individual teachers. And so designing effective reading and writing intervention materials, it requires significant expertise in instructional design principles, in the content area in which those instructional design principles are being developed to support. It also requires expertise in learning science, in addition to a lot of time. And I don't know about you, but I've had the gift of talking to several educators throughout the year, including school leaders. And people don't have a lot of time, especially now. We're very, very tired. And even under normal circumstances, the time that it would take to design an intervention curriculum resource on top of all the other things we're doing just isn't really a realistic expectation. So designing these things is by individual teachers is not something that we certainly expect would happen. There are some tools, though, that help people be able to carefully review and evaluate the quality of those intervention curriculum resources. And this is something known as the Taxonomy of Intervention Intensity. And you can see the PDF of the document there. It's from our colleagues at the National Center for Intensive Intervention. And the purpose of the Taxonomy of Intervention Intensity is to support educators in doing two things. It's to support educators or leaders who are responsible for reviewing, evaluating, and selecting curriculum resources. So it supports them in evaluating those things to determine what to use to provide intervention. And it's used for educators who are supporting the highest level of intervention supports that we would refer to as Tier 3, the most intensive level of intervention. These dimensions of intervention intensity are used to help build that intervention support for particular students. Interventions, when we think about reviewing and evaluating interventions, it's based on these dimensions that are in that left-hand column. So starting with strength, dosage, et cetera. And those dimensions, there are a few of them that we would use, that dosage, alignment, attention to transfer, comprehensiveness, behavioral supports, those would be used to intentionally build intervention intensity for students, which we're going to get into when we discuss practice 4. So when we think about reviewing and evaluating interventions, some key considerations, and I want to pre-correct for the fact that we are in no way, shape, or form wanting to send the impression that individual teachers who may be providing intervention supports or special educators who are working with students that have the most significant and persistent needs, that they would have to do this for every day and every single thing that they're using. What we are suggesting is that the district have a mechanism or a process by which things can be carefully reviewed and evaluated that certainly would call in individuals with the level of background knowledge and expertise in reading and writing to help inform these selections. But we certainly don't want to send the impression that people have time to go through these key considerations on a daily basis. So the people who are responsible for the review and evaluation of interventions would want to ask things related to these dimensions of intervention intensity. The first one being strength. So something like asking the question, does evidence suggest that the intervention is expected to improve outcomes? Will the group size, the duration, and the frequency of the intervention, will it provide sufficient opportunities for students to respond? So practice opportunities that are distributed, that are cumulative. Does the intervention match to the student's identified needs? So we're looking at alignment. That's another one of those dimensions of intervention intensity. Does it assist the student in generalizing the learned skills to a general education setting or to other tasks? That would be attention to transfer. For those of you which there are several of my colleagues on this call who have had the opportunity to deliver intervention instruction, I can attest to the fact that there are times where I would have students who would be able to use the strategy or the instructional routine that was taught. But once they left my individual classroom setting and went into a different setting like their classroom, suddenly they forgot that it would come in handy. And so this notion of attending to and transferring, generalizing these skills is something that has to be carefully prompted and supported along the way. A few other key go ahead, Sharon.
Oh, Kim, I just wanted to say that I wanted to bring us back to the simple view of reading and writing, because if you think about alignment, what you can think about is if students' primary needs are in the area of word reading, then the alignment would have a primary focus on word reading. And that doesn't mean that's all that's taught, but the level of emphasis would be adjusted, and that would be a form of alignment.
Okay, thank you, Sharon. You kind of cut out, but I think we got it. We cut out the word alignment. That'd be a form of alignment.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. Some of the other key considerations that we would look at when reviewing and evaluating intervention would be, does the intervention include these elements of explicit instruction, or in the case of the taxonomy of intervention, called comprehensiveness? We'd also want to look to see, does the student have opportunities to develop behavior skills needed to be successful? That would be behavioral supports. Can the intervention be easily integrated into academic instruction, academic support? And then last but not least, can the intervention be individualized? So can we take the components or the pieces of the evidence-based program or strategy, can it be individualized with a process by which we're using data to be able to determine how to accelerate the students' learning needs?
One more jump in, Kim.
Yeah.
If you can think about individualization as being customization, so it doesn't really mean that each individual child has each individual teaching approach, but more that you customize the instruction for the student's needs. And that could even include more than one student. It doesn't necessarily mean individually.
Absolutely. It could mean a group of students. We're not saying that this type of intervention instruction is always one-on-one. So that's a really good point of clarification, Sharon. One additional resource that we'd like to share to be able to help inform the careful review and evaluation of interventions is the Taxonomy of Intervention Intensity, the academic rating rubric. This too was developed by our colleagues at the National Center for Intensive Intervention. And I have had the gift of working with several people, not just in the state of Michigan, but other states, who've actually practiced using this academic rating rubric on a variety of intervention curriculum resources that are currently being used to support students as a way to be able to determine areas of strength and opportunities right out the gate where people could see that there would need to be a boost in terms of a dimension located on this left-hand side. That first column, those are the dimensions that were just on the previous, the two previous slides ago, but people can look proactively to see where do some of these intervention curriculum resources fare related to each of these dimensions of intervention intensity. And if you see an area like where it could be certainly lacking, like in behavioral supports, I've seen some schools actually proactively add some additional components to increase the likelihood that students are going to be successful. So let's chat for a moment. What are the benefits in using the dimensions of intervention intensity to guide intervention selection and evaluation? So using those dimensions of strength, dosage, alignment, behavioral supports, comprehensiveness, and individualization, attention to transfer, what are the benefits of using those things to guide intervention selection? I see we have some things coming through in the chat. I see comprehensive complete view. Excellent. And I see our colleague, Miss Melissa Nantes, added in the link to the rubric. Thank you, Melissa. Yeah, absolutely. Picking strong interventions, quality and fit, the specificity in the rubric. I see. Yep, excellent. And some people have said, gosh, this seems complex to do. I will tell you that I've seen folks try it out, and it took a couple of opportunities, a couple of practice opportunities, but soon people really did start to get the hang of it. Some more than others. Sharon, are you using the tools?
You know what I think is really helpful, Kim, is to ask yourself if students are making sluggish progress. Are they plateauing on my progress monitoring? I'm wondering if I am doing all of these elements of intensifying instruction, or if there are some of these elements that are being under considered in my own teaching or in the program I'm using. So you don't really have to take each student and do like a checklist on them, but it's much better to sort of say to yourself, I wonder how my program fits. Are there pieces of this that are missing? Should I try to figure out a way to support them? Should I select another program? So consider it more of a tool than something you memorize and apply for every student all the time.
Absolutely. So that moves us into essential practice 4. I am curious though. I'm curious if anyone on our call, because we have such collective expertise here on the call, has actually used the academic rating rubric, and if anyone's willing to open their mic and share. I certainly don't want to de-emphasize the amount of expertise that we have on this call. This is always the awkward Zoom moment. And it's okay if people say, no, I haven't done it, but I have questions about it. Feel free to share. Rebecca, you came off mute. Were you going to share?
Yeah, I'll just share. I did it with you initially with that cohort group that was just first going through this with you quite a few months ago. Yep. And I just felt that it gave me a discerning lens that I can carry with me. And I would appreciate more opportunities to do it. And I'm thankful for the reminder that it's there, because it really does give you a really focused way to look and make decisions.
Oh, thanks, Rebecca. Yes, that does seem like eons ago, doesn't it? Absolutely. Anyone else want to share? Or does anyone else have any questions they want to ask about the academic rating rubric? Lisa, were you going to add something?
I was just going to, can you hear me? I was just going to say that I didn't have the actual rubric, but when we did things, we actually kind of made up our own, and it did make it a lot easier to figure out what we really needed for students.
So being guided by some key features of intervention. Right. Yep. Right. Absolutely. It's always good to have some kind of guideposts to help us along the way. All right. Sharon, do you have anything you would add about people's use of the academic rating rubric, or what you've seen in your experiences?
So I would ask people to wonder about this. When you feel like students are performing confidently in your intensive instruction groups, to what extent is that learning being carried to other settings? Of course, that's the definition of generalization. But I think it is an area we underemphasize. So we often call it forgetting, but maybe forgetting is another way to express not deliberately teaching for generalization. Something to think about.
Excellent. Okay, well, I'm going to move on, and Sharon, you're helping to monitor the chat, right, my friend?
I'm doing it. I'm on it.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay. So we're moving into essential practice 4, which is the adaptations needed to increase the instructional intensity of the intervention. And so in this essential practice, we bring back some of those dimensions of intensive intervention. We bring back things like dosage, alignment, comprehensiveness, transfer, attention to transfer, and behavioral supports. We do this because when we're talking about students who need the most intensive level of intervention, which, by the way, really is reserved for approximately 5 to 7% of the school population, only because you would never have a sufficient resources to be able to do this level of intervention, of intensifying intervention with all students. And so we really do reserve this highest level of intervention to a small percentage of students. And the goal would be that if you have a student who has been receiving intervention instruction in a particular area, Sharon brought us back to the simple view of reading to help hone in on the primary skill that was being emphasized. And you find through progress monitoring data that the student is not responding as we would have expected during the intervention instruction, then we would need to start to look at data in a deeper way, use some either the progress monitoring data in a diagnostic way, perhaps administer diagnostic assessments. And we would do that to really think about how we could create an individualized intensive intervention plan where we are customizing, contextualizing the intervention instruction for students. So this is an example of what an individualized intensive intervention plan could entail. Remember, even though you're documenting for an individual student some of these customizations or contextualizing the intervention instruction, this does not mean that the intervention instruction is being delivered one-on-one. So we don't want to continue to reinforce that piece. With that said, though, we would want to carefully document what has been selected for the intervention, how things need to be customized to be able to address their particular students' particular needs. And we want to make sure that the intervention instruction is happening. Who's going to deliver it? Do they have the materials? We would also want to make sure that as it's being implemented, and data are being collected to monitor students' progress. And as we're making decisions about the student's response to the intervention instruction, we would want to place on the right-hand side here, we want to place to document notes for the types of adjustments or adaptations that are needed. And so based on the data, which we're going to see in a few minutes, the data may suggest choosing one or two dimensions that we would want to hone in on to adapt and document those adaptations to deliver the intervention. So you're going to see that come to life in these next few slides. Sharon, is there anything that you would add before I move on?
Perfect in every way.
Thank you. So the dimensions of intervention intensity that we hone in on in Essential Practice 4 are these dimensions. So notice that strength is not included here in Essential Practice 4. Strength is off, individualization is off, but it's okay that individualization's off this list because that example plan that I showed you is all about individualization or the customization, the contextualizing of the intervention supports for the student. We would be looking at alignment, dosage, and we're going to look at dosage in two ways. We're going to look at the way in which the lesson is designed, those types of, in terms of increasing the dosage for certain components of the lesson. And we're going to also look at what we would refer to as some structural dosage adaptations. Comprehensiveness, which is explicit instruction, attention to transfer, and behavior supports. So in terms of alignment adaptations, Sharon gave a nod to this earlier on when we were in Essential Practice 2, that the teacher is determining ways in which the current intervention is actually meeting the students' needs. We know that students' data is going to help determine some primary skills that we need to hone the instruction in on. And I will say that as we move through the grades, especially some of the work that I know Sharon, myself, and others are doing related to adolescent literacy, the older students get, the more multi-component interventions are used. We have students whose primary need may be decoding multi-syllable words, But when we have middle and high school students or students that are in that adolescent reading band, 4th grade through 12th grade, we have to be building their vocabulary. We have to be looking at things like using prefixes and suffixes and helping them know the meanings of prefixes and suffixes and giving a nod to morphology, comprehension, their ability to apply what they're learning to connected text and make meaning. And so even though the data yields a primary skill that we need to intervene and ensure that we are providing intervention instruction, we would be remiss if we're not carefully looking at those other dimensions or components that are needed to develop skilled readers and writers. And you find those in a lot of intervention curriculum resources, especially for the older grades. Sharon, you look like you wanted to add something. What would you add?
This may be a little sidetrack. I don't mean it to be, but I've had a couple of private as well as public chats with people about the difference between tier 2 and tier 3.
Mm-hmm.
And as we talk about alignment, maybe we can think about it that way. So, by the way, I am speaking about my views. I am not speaking on behalf of Michigan. So if I get any of this wrong, Kim, just jump in and say that's not the way we think about it. So the way I think about tier 2 instruction, because that might help people get organized, is that tier 2 really focuses on prevention and standardization. We don't have much tier 2 instruction after grade 3. We're really moving into tier 3 then. And you can have tier 3 earlier, but it is a function of the fact that the student's response to the tier 2 intervention, which is more standardized and less aligned, is inadequate. So if you think about a student who is in 1st or 2nd grade, and you recognize that this student is consistently not adequately responded to effective tier 1 instruction, then tier 2, which is by standardized, I mean you have selected a scientifically based program that is typically associated with accelerating outcomes for that population. That student is provided that intervention, usually in a small group. And the progress is monitored, and there's an expected level of progress that will occur. And as long as that progress is occurring, tier 2 is a very effective alternative. And the expectation is, because we're working on prevention, that the combination of tier 2 and tier 1 will eventually yield an outcome such that the student is only in tier 1. Now that may take 20 weeks, it might take 30 weeks, depending upon the student, but the expectation is that they are moving towards the fact that they will exit tier 2 and only be in tier 1. However, there are some students, as Kim said earlier, a small number, for whom this more standardized approach is not yielding the desired outcome. And these students are likely to be thought of as tier 3 students, some of whom may be referred and placed in special education. And this is where the more intensive, aligned intervention that is being presented, the more customized approach, takes place. So in my mind, tier 2 is more standardized, tier 3 is more customized. And we're leaning right now more on the tier 3 side. However, once students get into the older grades, we aren't thinking about prevention anymore. When you're in 5th grade and you are 3 grade levels behind, we're not really saying we got to prevent reading problems. We're saying we got to do something fast and it better be intensive. So we're on to tier 3. I hope that helps a little bit. And of course, if that doesn't align with Michigan's view, I'm sure someone will straighten me out.
No, that does align. I mean, standard treatment protocol is a term that we use for what is typically should be typically, we believe, happening in tier 2. But at the same time, one thing that I will add, I'm sorry, we have someone off of mute. Okay. At the same time, though, I think that so Sharon, I guess I'm going to be very, very honest. I see a lot of people, not just in our state, but across the country, who even for tier 2 are designing individual lessons, but not going towards an evidence-based curriculum resource. And so so standard treatment protocol is already something that is not happening, that's being compromised. So I guess my question to you, I know you kind of like shook your head, and if our colleague Hank Fien were on, I wish he could share his story, but I do think there are some risks with people not reviewing and evaluating curriculum resources that could be used for intervention. I'm curious what some of your thoughts are, especially for tier 2, for students that really do need, that could benefit from standardized curriculum intervention.
My advice is consider a standardized evidence-based approach. As a teacher, do not check your good ideas. Do not check your knowledge at the door. Bring your knowledge and thoughtful and responsive ideas to the instruction. Because you use a standardized approach doesn't mean that you are a thoughtless robotic teacher. It means you are a smart, well-informed teacher who wants to release your efforts and energies so you can think and respond to the students you're teaching using an evidence-based approach. It doesn't mean that you memorize it and give it like a robot. Absolutely not. I do not think that's not only is it not necessary, it's undesirable. You are an extremely talented person and your talents need to come. But that doesn't mean that you need to build the airplane you're going to fly in. I can be a very talented pilot, but I want the airplane built by somebody else.
Thank you, Sharon. All right, so let's see. So we've talked about alignment adaptations. So here's an example. So if we have a student who's receiving an intensive intervention, and we're defining intensive intervention consistent with the way in which Sharon had defined intensive intervention, small percentage of students. This is more customization, contextualizing the intervention to meet their needs. So if you have a student that is receiving intensive intervention who in phonics and word recognition skills, the student is a 4th grader struggling to read multi-syllable words. And you've got, this student can apply the strategy, and this is a true student. I have the gift of still tutoring students. And so from August to right after winter break, I was working with a 4th grader. And this 4th grader could accurately apply the strategy for reading multi-syllable words. However, when it came to reading irregular words, sometimes the pronunciation doesn't match. So a real basic example would be, think of the word mountain. If sounded out in the way that many people would think that those graphemes represent the sounds, it'd be mountain, but it wouldn't be mountain. The real word is mountain. And so there were some times where this student would sound out a word, but the word's pronunciation didn't match the pronunciation of the word that I knew was in the child's mental lexicon or mental dictionary. And so the student could benefit, it did benefit from me modifying my existing intervention instruction, because I was using an intervention program that was standard. It was standard treatment protocol at first, and then based on the data, we had to customize. And this particular program had a lesson component that had been faded about 15 lessons in, that was referred to as close approximation set for variability, where I would orally pronounce words, and I would segment the words parts. And then I would read those, I would pronounce them as if they would normally be sounded out, but it wouldn't be the correct pronunciation given the word in my mental dictionary. And I would read it in the context of a sentence. And the student would figure out what the word is. And this student loved that activity. And some of you, I think, may even know the intervention program that I'm referring to. Kids love that component because they think of it as a game. Unfortunately, though, they don't think about what that lesson component actually teaches, which is there's going to be several words in the English language that are not going to be pronounce the way that they are sounded out because of schwas and other, other types of, and I shouldn't say issues with the English language, but we have a complex language. So I needed to pull back for a couple of lessons,
No, it goes
that
upward.
intervention component.
I'm gonna
I
listen to it.
pulled it back. Oh, hang on a second. Hang on. If you could just make sure you're muted. Hang on a second. Oh, thank you, Melissa. And I apologize. Everyone should have been muted when they came in, but that did not work on my Zoom account today. So anyways, I pulled back that lesson component, but I actually read some of the passages that the passage the student was going to read for that lesson. I anticipated some of the words that I believed he would mispronounce. He wouldn't be able to adjust or flex the pronunciation to match the word in his mental dictionary. And so I, in essence, did kind of a pre-teach before we actually came across those words in the passage. And I kid you not, this particular student said to me after we did that the first time, he goes, so that's why we did that lesson component in the intervention program. I never knew that was the purpose of it. I said, no, I know that was a teacher error. I said, I should have done a better job helping you see the connection, but it was kind of fun. What wasn't it? He goes, yeah, I miss doing it, but now I get why we had to do it. That's an example of where I very much looked at the student's need. I knew, given the intervention that we were in, that we had faded that component too soon, in part because of my error. And I brought it back just to be able to have him apply the strategy to the actual text in preparation to the text he was going to be reading during that lesson. So that's an example of an alignment adaptation. It's only one. There are so many others that we could share that would be completely predicated on the student's data. Some dosage adaptations that we could talk about would be, remember, there's two types of dosage adaptations. There's the first one, lesson design dosage adaptations and structural dosage adaptations. So if we think about lesson design dosage adaptations, the teacher could create the conditions in which the number of practice opportunities for the students are increased. It's important that this is not mass practice. This is not about practicing all at once. Practice, for those of you who have spent a lot of time with our colleague, Dr. Anita Archer, on explicit instruction, Anita does quite a bit around practice, and practice has to be distributed over time. It has to be cumulative. Mass practice isn't going to be the thing that's going to move the needle. And so we have to be careful about practice. There truly is a method to the madness. But in this case, the teacher could create the conditions to increase the practice opportunities for students, perhaps by looking at ways to do distributed review over time, cumulative review. And this does begin to blend into those elements of explicit instruction or comprehensiveness. So an example, a real student example, is that the teacher could also tighten up the students' active participation procedure. So making sure that students are actively engaged in the lesson. And by doing so, the teacher could make sure there's adequate thinking time, could include some more partner responses, and the students could, the teacher could be ensuring that he or she is monitoring students' responses and able to provide the affirmative, corrective, informative feedback. Also thinking about reducing teacher talk, and in order to make more time for students to be able to apply their learning and practice what it is that is the focus of the lesson. Sharon, is there anything that you would add about this dimension?
Just the following. If I asked you, all 160 plus of you, whether or not you see explicit instruction regularly, that is instruction that is clear, focused, opportunities to respond, considers the principles of learning, and is applied judiciously, smartly, and crisply. How many of you would say you see that most of the time? How many of you would say you see that some of the time? How many of you would say you see that not as much as you'd like, not much of the time, or rarely? I say that to you because I offer that as we learn more and more about the science of learning and the science of teaching, what we're learning is that explicitness applied judiciously and smartly is the secret sauce of success. So as you prioritize what you're going to focus on as coaches, leaders, and teachers, move explicit instruction way up.
Yeah, we're starting to see some responses. So not enough of the time is one person's response. I'm not sure if there's others or if people would like to come off mute and share their experiences. While people are adding, and I know that Sharon will be responding to everyone's, and Melissa added, Sharon, from your Meadows Center, the 10 key policies and practices for explicit instruction. Yep. Excellent. So in terms of structural dosage adaptations, we would be thinking about things like increasing the number of intervention sessions, increasing the number of instructional minutes for the intervention session, possibly reducing the number of students that are participating in the particular group, also increasing the ratio of adults to students. So I've seen in some situations in middle school settings, I've seen the interventionist also have an assistant that helps with the monitoring and providing the feedback, also helps with some of the additional practice opportunities. So these are structural dosage adaptations. Now, one point of caution is that the reason why we didn't start with structural dosage adaptations is because I tend to see just in multiple spaces, people talking about, well, let's reduce the group size. And let's look at increasing the number of intervention sessions. But if we're not focusing on the lesson design, or even back it up, making sure that the intervention is aligned to the student's needs, these types of structural dosage adaptations aren't going to help to accelerate student outcomes. So we have to be very careful about structural dosage adaptations. We have to be careful about all of these things, which is why Essential Practice 1 is about people understanding the learning progressions for developing skilled readers and writers. If we don't understand how this happens and carefully review and evaluate things to use for intervention, and then make sure that we are designing the lesson or the lessons designed with the right types of lesson dosage adaptations, thinking then about structural dosage adaptations, all these things bleed into each other, which you heard Sharon say right at the get-go, that these essential practices are very much integrated. And even though they are sequenced, they are integrated with one another.
So Kim, I have to jump in and say one thing that I have observed, and is this. If we change the grouping structure to make it smaller, so we go from a group size of 10 to 5, or a group size of 5 to 3, and we provide the same instruction in the same way, guess what the result is? You're right, you get exactly the same result you had before. So making the group size smaller, but not changing the customization of the instruction, the explicitness, the number of practice, et cetera, you're going to get the same result. So I like small group size. I like tier 3 reducing the group size, but I only like it when you change the instruction to match the adjustment in the group size. Only doing one of those things, you might as well do neither of them.
Thank you, Sharon. When we think about comprehensiveness, this is where those elements of explicit instruction come into play. And there's a really nice cheat sheet that Dr. Archer has provided where she's taken the 13 elements of explicit instruction and she has broken them down in or categorized them into 4 areas related to content, the design of instruction, the delivery of instruction, and judicious practice. And so when we think about some of the adaptations that could be made related to comprehensiveness or elements of explicit instruction, the teacher could adjust the intervention instruction by using clear, more concise instructional language, provide an additional model. Notice I'm not saying lots of modeling, because just modeling is not in and of itself is not going to do the trick. I could model, and if I'm not having students meaningfully practice the components of the skills that I'm teaching, then it's not moving that information from short-term memory into long-term memory. So perhaps providing an additional model, more practice opportunities, and it's judicious practice, like our colleague, Dr. Archer has said, and making sure that the independent practice is sufficient and it provides cumulative review. One thing that I forgot to mention was the importance of fading. We want to make sure that the instructional supports are faded. If I'm providing a heavy level of modeling and practice, and I'm not intentionally teaching the students how to independently apply these strategies, then I've in essence created overdependence on me. And that's a problem because I don't go home with all the students. And so the gradual fading of instructional supports is another type of adaptation that could be made under this comprehensiveness dimension of intensive intervention. The attention to transfer or generalization, as you've heard Sharon and myself refer to it, is that the teacher could incorporate words or texts that are being used from the students' classes into the intervention lesson. I will tell you, my colleague, I don't know if my colleague John Vale is on, but John Vale, who was one of our wonderful adolescent literacy instructional coaches for a federally funded adolescent literacy model demonstration grant, one of the intervention curriculum resources that he was coaching teachers to use was teaching a comprehension strategy, teaching SQ3R, survey, question, read, recite, review. And it was being, in addition to helping students understand text structure, this particular intervention curriculum resource, though, did a beautiful job of attention to transfer, built right in to the intervention from the get-go, which you don't see often. I mean, when you're evaluating interventions, you typically don't see behavioral supports right out the gate incorporated into the intervention curriculum resource. You also don't necessarily see things like attention to transfer being paid to right away. But in this particular intervention resource, students were bringing their text from one of their core subject area classes, whether it was science or social studies, whichever class that had text had headings and subheadings, because you would need those features to make SQ3R an effective strategy. But they were actually bringing that text to intervention to learn to apply the strategy with the teacher's scaffolding. And so that attention to transfer doesn't only happen in that direction. It doesn't only go from core subject area classes or classroom setting into intervention. It also goes from intervention teacher working with core subject area teachers and classroom teachers to understand the types of instructional routines and strategies that students are learning, so that the teachers can intentionally prompt and model the use of these things in the context of the classroom. So attention to transfer goes both ways, but sometimes you don't find it in a lot of curriculum resources. Sharon, is there anything you would add? You didn't come off of mute, but you always have words of wisdom to share.
Well, I'm having a good time listening right now and responding in the chat, so nothing more.
Oh, I forgot you're doing the chat. Thank you. The last dimension is behavioral support adaptations. So additional behavioral supports can be incorporated into the intervention instruction. And we're doing this to increase the students' overall motivation, their engagement, their success in the intervention instruction. So there's some types of adaptations that we could look at making if the student's data suggests that it's a need. One could be, you could adjust the physical environment of the intervention classroom or the classroom in which the intervention is occurring. You could intentionally build in strategies to help the students be able to persist in being able to engage in the lesson, complete the activities. We could also incorporate ways to help the student monitor their level of engagement during the intervention instruction, and some additional strategies to be able to reduce any type of off-task behaviors. We have to remember that for many of our students, especially the older students for some students, they have been, they have recognized their struggle with learning to read since perhaps first grade. And so when you have a student that is now in upper elementary, middle, or high school, they oftentimes have a low perceived probability of success. And it's human nature to try to escape or avoid things that we're not good at doing. Sadly, I'm not a math person. I'm learning, but I'm not the person you would want, teaching any child math. And I can tell you that I wanted to avoid stats courses when I was getting my master's degree or my, any other type of degree. I would avoid stats courses because I was brought back to the horror of trigonometry and algebra and whatnot. And many of our students are feeling sometimes the same way. It's human nature to want to avoid things that we don't feel we're good at. So we have to have ways to help students persevere and say it's okay. These things are going to be difficult, but we're going to help them to make those things easier. Sharon, were you going to add something? Because you did come off mute.
Oh, when I work with older students, we call the class linguistics. We call it Longhorn linguistics. I'm at the University of Texas and we're the Longhorns, so just bear with that. So we call it Longhorn linguistics, and we explain that linguistics is a very sophisticated subject. And we start by teaching them the sophisticated things like schwa, and we use words that linguists use. And and then we still work on the foundation skills, but we use much more technical language. And we tell them that nobody else in the school will understand this. And it's, of course, and we also work very heavily on using texts that are nutritious, meaning not just about hurricanes and other notorious events, but our athletes. We don't just do that, forget that. We make it nutritious, but we also make it interesting and engaging. And we've really had we read menus. That's the other thing we do. We read things they would be interested in. So we take posts that they would be interested in, pods that they would be interested in, activities like the guide for getting a successful driver's license. We take text from that, things they really need to know and do. So it has nutritious value, but it also is engaging. So I just thought I'd say that because that has really helped.
Absolutely. So I see a lot of some things put in the chat, people appreciating, including behavioral supports. From a MTSS technical assistance perspective, we 100% fully have embraced and see the importance of integrating the academic supports with the behavioral supports. Some of our colleagues, like for those of you who've had the gift of hearing Randy Sprick present, I've heard Randy present it as the ultimate chicken and egg question, which comes first, the behavioral supports or the academic supports. And it is something that we have to pay very close attention to when we're talking about intensive intervention. If you want some additional examples of those kind of 4 types of behavioral support adaptations, you can refer to pages 22 and 23 from the Intensifying Guide, and you'll see some spelled out examples written there. So I'm curious, we want to hear from you, although you guys have been doing a wonderful job being engaged in the chat. This is one of the reasons why I love seeing people's faces and having the chat open. I'm curious, what do you see as benefits in using the process that we just described for adapting and intensifying intervention instruction? What do you guys see as some of the benefits of the things that we're talking about, particularly in this essential practice? And feel free, if you don't want to chat, but you want to talk, feel free to come off mute and share some of your thoughts or certainly questions. I will say, Sharon, while we're waiting for people to add some chats, I know a colleague of ours, Sarah Arden, who is one of your colleagues too, one of your students. Sarah and I have said that we always are, we actually wanted to know if any research has been done, and if not, we wanted to conduct a study that looked at which dimensions of intensive intervention tend to be adapted more than others when people are contextualizing intervention instruction. And I'm curious if that's something that you've ever thought of, or you've given any attention or thinking about.
The one that has been studied the most for intensive interventions is group size.
Well, you already gave the impact of that.
Yeah.
Minus.
And you have to get to group sizes of 3 or smaller to have a significant impact with group size. If you are moving from a group size of 15 to 10, that's just not going to do it. I mean, it's more expensive and we will like it more as teachers, but the students do not differentially benefit.
Are there any other kind of dimensions of intensive intervention that you know of that have been studied?
Explicit instruction and systematic instruction, yes. The standardized approaches for tier 2, yes. Transfer, deliberate instruction for transfer has been studied and is associated with improved outcomes, but it's only associated with improved outcomes in follow-up data. So literally the outcomes at the end of the study are not differential, but because you teach transfer, if you come back in 3 months or 6 months, they're more likely to remember it.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing.
Mm.
Any other thoughts or questions from the group? I see people taking copious notes. I know I wish our colleague Sarah Arden was on to hear some of these things, Sharon.
Well, I can share with Sarah.
Yes, you can. All right, so we're going to have time to open up for questions. We have about 15 minutes left, but I wanted, Sharon, I wanted to end with this quote that you actually wrote into the Intensifying guide. So I'm going to turn it over to you because it's your quote that you wrote into the guide.
Well, you know, it's funny. The origin of this quote is that I was doing a lot of talks nationally about how important the job that we have taken on as being responsible for children's literacy. And we have taken that job on. And I was doing talks about how necessary it is for us to view ourselves as instrumental in this acquisition, that we aren't just the guide on the side. Students' literacy depends on us. And it depends on what we do, and it depends on how we do. And that once we sort of take the baton and say, I'm responsible and I'm going to make sure students learn to read, then we have to sort of say, why is that so important? And the reason it is because literacy is the green card that gives students access to additional learning and to a successful life. And in fact, around the world, no matter where you are, if you want to oppress people, whether you want to oppress people of color, or whether you want to oppress women, what you do is deny them access to literacy. And Frederick Douglass said this so well when he said, once you learn to read, you will be forever free. And to me, reading provides the ultimate pathway to opportunity, whether it's an opportunity to enjoy, learn, share experiences, broaden horizons. It's the gift that allows all of these things to occur.
That's a really great way to kind of sum up the major pieces of our presentation. I want to open it up for people to ask questions. I mean, we intentionally built in some extra time, so we've got about 15 minutes, a little bit less. Who has some questions that you wanted to ask? I know it's so hard when you're thinking of questions on the spot. Okay, we've got where can I find the intensifying guide? So Melissa's going to drop into the chat the exact link, but if you saw the PowerPoint, you can go right back to the beginning of the PowerPoint on slide 2 that has the link right to our MiMTSS TA Center website, along with an ordering form. So if you wanted to order printed copies for your staff, please do so. I noticed Sharon has asked Brandy Bugni. Brandy, let's hear from you. You were very instrumental in this work before you left Michigan Department of Education. So sad. What would you add?
Well, I was feeling super excited that it was the document was done and ready when we were working on the equity for literacy document, because we were able to take a lot of what the team had put into the intensifying and work it into how do you provide literacy learning for students that's equitable. And a lot of it comes down to, do teachers really understand those reading and writing progressions? Do they understand the best ways to differentiate and then provide tier 2 and tier 3 training? So I was really excited that before I left the department, we were able to work it really practically into that document. Not nearly in depth as what Kim wished I would have been able to accomplish there, but we have the guide, and then we have some practical use for it too. So I'm just so grateful for the team pulling together the document, and I have shared it wide and far everywhere I go. When somebody says we're doing MTSS and we're doing reading, and I say, then you definitely have to have this document. So thank you for everyone who put it together.
Thank you, Brandy. So Sharon, we do have a question. How do we avoid falling into programmatic solutions as opposed to explicit targeted instruction? What would you add?
Well, I mean, I would offer that the two are not independent and non-overlapping. What I mean by that is, if you have a programmatic solution, it really does not prevent you from providing explicit targeted instruction. Explicit targeted instruction is what teachers bring to any successful program they are using. So that's kind of what I was trying to say earlier, but maybe not as clearly as I wanted to, which is that we do not check our good teaching, our good thinking, our responsiveness to the learner at the door when we use a program. We weave what we know about good teaching into that programmatic instruction. I'm not sure, Kim, what do you think about that?
No, I completely agree with you. I think that programs get a bad rap. But it takes the instruction to bring the program to life. And I can tell you that I appreciate tutoring using something that's already developed, because I couldn't work all day and then come home and develop lessons to support a student. So I believe the explicit teaching is bringing the program to life, although not all the programs. There are programs out there that they don't address comprehensiveness or those elements of explicit instruction. And again, having educators really knowledgeable in those elements of explicit instruction will help bring that program to life.
Can I add to that, Kim? I'm just chopping a bit here. It takes us back to where we started with really understanding Scarborough's rope and understanding the simple view, so that when you're in the middle of that program, you have a discerning lens, and then you can see the value of the program, and you can know what your teaching moves are therein, and really understanding explicit instruction and corrective feedback and positive feedback. That's that behavioral piece. So they're all so integrated that I love that you started with Scarborough's and the simple view.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really kind of helps to set people's mind frame of what we really mean by a learning progression for developing skilled readers and writers. Absolutely. Anything, let's see, we've got, Jennifer raised a great point. There isn't enough explicit instruction at tier 1. Yeah, I totally agree. And then leave tier 2 students solely to those that may not have enough training experience at tier 2. Could not agree more. And like Sharon said, absolutely can imagine that that's true. Thank you for that. All right.
I
Well,
think also in tier one, my observation is that many children will learn no matter how we teach. We get reinforced as teachers because learning to read for, as many as 50% of students is, it doesn't require the kind of explicitness, the kind of customization, the kind of dimensions that we've talked about here. They are really learning machines. And thank goodness, it's wonderful. And so that level of precision is really relegated to students who have, who are not as easily able to access print. And we have to understand that because we are successful for some, it means we're only doing some of our job. And that in order to do all of our job, we have to be successful for all. And it means that we have to utilize some of these dimensions we were talking about, otherwise that won't occur. And it's a heavy lift. We're asking a lot. And we need to realize that, but we also need to figure out ways to support, encourage, and really make it real to all of us that every single student in our class has the right to access literacy, as Frederick Douglass says, in order to make us free.
absolutely. One private question that I got was more around the literacy essentials and how do these 5 practices align with the literacy essentials? So I just, again, want to underscore the fact that we are not in any way, shape, or form saying that focus on intensifying literacy instruction on those 5 practices. These things are meant to work together within the school setting. I will say that I had a chance before our time together to go through all of the essential practice spanning from pre-K through the 6 through 12 essentials, and really color coded them for each of the 5 essential practices. One of the unique contributions that this Intensifying Literacy Instruction Guide adds to the field of knowledge is essential practice 4, the adaptations to intensify intervention instruction. When you look across all of the essential practices, while terms like differentiation and other things are used, honing in on those dimensions of intervention intensity and thinking about how to use the data to meaningfully adapt and contextualize or customize the intervention is a nice value add to this suite of literacy essentials. I think that a lot of the essential practices, if you were to put them in a bucket, like if you were to take each of the essential practices across the grade levels and plop them into a bucket, you would have a lot of them that align with essential practice 1, which is the learning progression. For example, for the K3 essentials, you'll see things like read alouds for books, developing vocabulary, activities to build phonological awareness, explicit instruction in letter sound associations, research in standards aligned instruction for writing, intentional and ambitious efforts to build vocabulary. You could connect each of those essential practices to the learning progression and the information spelled out in essential practice 1. You could also see you can see one of the practices touching on assessment, or essential practice 3, which is using data. For example, in the K3 essentials, ongoing observation and assessment of children's language and literacy that informs their education. That would be an example of using assessment that's in its broadest sense. In the Intensifying Guide, we talk about the use of screening, 2 types of progress monitoring assessment data, and diagnostic data. So I could see some alignment there. And you could also see some of the essential practices that give a nod to the infrastructures or the ways in which teachers could create and organize class-wide instruction to effectively teach reading and writing, like in the K3 essentials, small group and individual instruction using a variety of grouping strategies with flexible groups formed and instruction targeted to children's observed and assessed needs. Well, you got to create a structure to ensure that those groups can happen. Students are successful, expectations are taught, right? Monitored, et cetera. And it would also give a nod to essential practice 1, because if you're going to group kids and differentiate instruction, you'd want to know the areas, you want to understand the learning progression. So I know that's a quick drive-by of some of the nuances of how the information, the Intensifying guide aligns with the literacy essentials, but I do know that these are supposed to work together to support learner outcomes. So Sharon, any closing remarks in our last 2 minutes?
Here's my last words, and they came from a correspondence I had with one of the participants that was private, or whatever they call that. But anyway, what they said is that, it's really often that individuals will say, I'm using the program, I'm doing it. And they follow the program, but they aren't thinking about what they're doing. They're not customizing, they're not using these critical features. And I just wanted to say that I think that's a really important point. And that's why the customization is important.
Thank you. So with that said, I know Melissa has dropped the link for the evaluation for today's webinar, but you can also scan, take a picture of this, the QR code, whatever it's called, and fill out the evaluation. We want to thank you for spending your time with us, and we hope that that this gives you kind of your first touch into the contents of the Intensifying Literacy Instruction Guide. So thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of the week, and you're almost done with school, so yay. I mean, thank you for all you guys have done. Have a wonderful rest of your day, guys. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Sharon. Thank you. Bye, Brandy.